Hello there! This is part 2 of What if the Galaxy found out that Vader was actually Anakin Skywalker, just after the events of Revenge of the Sith. Now, as I said in part 1 of this video, this was actually only ever supposed to be one part, but the video became so long that I had to cut it in half. So I'll quickly recap what's happened in the first video. Essentially, Vader's identity has become known to the whole galaxy thanks to the Grand Inquisitor doing some things. And following the destruction of the first Death Star, an Imperial coup has formed. Now, this allows me to tell you the other suggestion which inspired this video, because as I also said in the first video, this video, or what ended up being 2 videos, was inspired by 2 comments from you guys. The first one was, what if the galaxy found out that Vader was Anakin Skywalker? But the second was, what if some Imperial forces formed a coup against the larger empire? And so, without further ado, let's get on with the video. We shall call this group of Imperials the United Imperial reformists. They would believe that the galaxy did need an empire, but that ultimately the current leadership was flawed, that the Emperor was unable to lead at this time of war against the rebellion, and that a council of more experienced military tacticians should lead until the war was over, and then a new Emperor could be appointed during peacetime. Furthermore, they would believe the current rule of the Empire to be too heavily reliant on fear and oppression. It's just quickly worth noting that no one within this coup would ever have actually met Vader or Palpatine. Vader, meanwhile, would appear to be rather disinterested in this new UER, the United Imperial Reformists, and would be far more bothered about finding the pilot who had blown up the Death Star, like we see him doing in the comics. And just like in the comics, he would employ Boba Fett, as although the underworld had largely crumbled, the Empire would still use the elite bounty hunters, and so Vader would discover from Boba that this pilot was from Tatooine and called himself Luke Lars. Vader would decide he now needed to investigate by himself. The name Lars from Tatooine seemed a little too much of a coincidence, and if there was something more to this boy, he didn't want anyone knowing. After all, the last time someone discovered the identity of a Force user from Tatooine, it had resulted in him now being constantly reminded of his past. It's worth noting at this point, Vader would be, if anything, more powerful with the dark side than in the standard continuity. The revelation of his past would constantly haunt him, although no one other than Sidious, who had spoke the name Anakin or Skywalker around Vader for the last 19 years, would have survived the ordeal. In a strange way, he would be grateful that the Grand Inquisitor had made his past known, although that did not absolve him of the painful death Vader would have provided on learning that he was responsible. Before that, Vader had hoped to pretend the past hadn't happened due to the pain of loss, but now, after 19 years of living with this pain fueling his anger, he would be far more powerful with the dark side. He had to live with the fact that he had lost everything: his friends, his wife, his purpose, his life. And once it was all gone, he couldn't lose the one reminder of all these things, the name Anakin Skywalker. So when Vader heard that potentially the son of Owen Lars was out in the galaxy, a rebel hero, he would remember how this, again potentially, boy's grandfather had failed to protect Anakin Skywalker's mother. The Lars family was at least somewhat responsible for the pain that Vader felt, and therefore Vader would go after Luke with the pure intention to kill him. So Vader would begin to track Luke, trying to both find him and information about him, but he would do it alone. His first stop would be on Tatooine. After 18 standard years of trying to understand Vader, and more importantly, whether there was any hope for Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka and Rex would be beginning to give up. Although there was clearly some light left in Vader, with each world he visited, with each massacre he left in his wake, this light would quickly be fading entirely. It wouldn't have been a complete waste of time, however. The two of them would have successfully provided information on Vader's movements to the rebellion, probably saving thousands of rebel lives. However, when the two of them found out that Vader was on Tatooine, it would rekindle some of the hope of Anakin's redemption. Why would he be going to his birth planet? It held no strategic importance, and by this point any of the Imperial troops and officers based on Tatooine would have joined the UER and left the planet. In this lack of Imperial oppression, the planet would have begun to fall under the control of various new gangs, but this would be nothing new. It would be the same story on many Outer Rim planets, so the only reason Ahsoka and Rex would be able to think of for Vader travelling there was because it was something personal. Personal not to Vader, but to Anakin Skywalker. Meanwhile, the UER would be continuing to gain support, reaching out to system after system to join this new age of the Empire. The Emperor would be aware of this, but unfortunately would be somewhat trapped in how to respond. If he responded with anger and rage, then the narrative of a fear-driven Empire would only be furthered. If, however, he responded in a way which promoted his facade of a caring old man, it could cause the narrative of an unfit leader. For the first time in his life, basically, the Emperor would be unsure of how to proceed. Of course, he would not let anyone know of this, but without Vader around as much, due to him trying to find the pilot who destroyed the Death Star, Palpatine would be forced to withdraw forces from some systems in order to prepare for a potential conflict with either the UER or the Rebellion. Of course, withdrawing these forces should also prevent them joining the UER. So now, on planets with no Imperial presence, the Rebellion would flourish, albeit it would have to compete with some new criminal organisations. On other worlds, there would be conflict between the Rebellion and the UER, as they fought for control of the systems, or between the UER and the Imperial Loyalist forces, which is what we'll call the Emperor's loyal followers. Although these wouldn't last long due to the Loyalists either quickly joining the UER or the UER retreating quickly in attempts to not lose too many of their forces. Or the fights would be between the Loyalists and the Rebellion. But Tatooine would be one of the few worlds without any conflict. No Rebellion, no Empire, well, except Vader, who would be trying to find out about this Luke Lars, whether that be through visiting abandoned homesteads or enquiring of the locals. After retrieving information from some Jawas, he would eventually discover that Luke Lars was not Owen Lars's biological son. The Jawas would have explained that about 20 standard years before, they had seen a wizard that lived in the Jundland wastelands give a child to the Lars family. Vader would have them take him to this apparent wizard's house, but would just find it stripped to a shell by both sandstorms and local merchants. But something about this place would seem somewhat familiar to Vader, despite never having gone there before. A few hours later, Rex and Ahsoka would arrive at the same homestead, except now the whole area would be littered with dead Jawas. And just like with Vader, the two of them would find nothing, except a set of footprints leading away from the site back towards the Lars homestead. Back at the Lars homestead, Vader would return to a place he had never wanted to be again. Standing over a gravestone, the Sith would be overcome with grief. The part of him he'd rejected for so long, the part of him which the galaxy refused to let him forget, the part of him which had brought him back to this place, Anakin Skywalker, would resurface for the first time in many standard years. And in that moment, Ahsoka would sense a familiar presence. She would know that, however long it may have been, Anakin was now alive. The hope that she and Rex had been looking for, that there was still light in their friend, would be rekindled. Now the Rebellion would be spread throughout the galaxy and would have a base on one of the moons of Geonosis. After the destruction of Alderaan and Bail Organa, many members of the Rebellion would begin to think that Ahsoka and Rex would be far more effective serving the Rebellion in different roles to the current ones that they were serving in. After all, Rex was one of the most successful captains during the Clone Wars, and Ahsoka was rather good in combat to say the least. So despite allowing the two to continue for the time being, these certain members of the Rebellion would not entirely trust them, as only Bail would have known their true purpose for tracking Vader. These members of the Alliance would have their own informants around the galaxy, who would, amongst other things, be able to provide information on the two Clone Wars veterans. And on Tatooine, there would be one such informant. We'll say it's Max Rebo, who needed more work following the destruction of the Hutt cartel. Max, upon realising that Ahsoka and Rex were nearby, would proceed to track them, only to find that they were tracking Vader, specifically Vader without any other Imperials. He would immediately contact the Alliance, who would decide that now was the perfect time to neutralise the Sith, and would dispatch all rebels from the Geonosis moon, because it's close by in the galaxy, to attack Vader on Tatooine, along with any rebels who happen to be nearby. Meanwhile, back on the planet, Ahsoka and Rex would have followed Vader's footprints back to the Lars homestead, and there they would find Vader, Anakin, knelt by a grave, grief emanating from him. Vader would turn as he felt his former apprentice's presence, and after a long pause as the three former Clone Wars friends looked at each other, Vader would speak. He would ask them what they were doing there, and that if they had come to save him, then they were mistaken in trying. Ahsoka would cut him off, saying that she knew the light was inside him, that it was Anakin behind that mask. At mention of his name, that name, the anger inside Vader would be rekindled, and the Sith would choke his former Padawan and captain until they were unconscious. However, this would be the first time that someone had spoken that name around Vader and lived. Vader, after managing to re-embrace his rage, would contact Imperial High Command requesting that they brought his Star Destroyer to Tatooine to pick up the two rebel agents. However, Sidious, upon learning of Vader's request, would decide to take his own Star Destroyer, the Eclipse, along with a fleet of Star Destroyers to retrieve these spies, but more importantly Vader, because Sidious wouldn't trust his apprentice to return to Imperial duties, so would want to personally retrieve him, especially from a planet which had the history to Vader that Tatooine did. So Sidious would take a fleet to Tatooine. Unfortunately for Sidious, there would be UER sympathisers within his high command, who would form the UER of his movements away from the core. They would know that this was probably the best chance of overthrowing the Emperor whilst he was exposed rather than hiding on Coruscant, and would proceed to mobilise their own fleet to Tatooine. And so, all at once, above the normally uneventful planet of Tatooine, there would be the largest battle the galaxy had ever seen, as Rebel forces engaged two lots of Imperial forces, the UER and Imperial Loyalists, who would also engage one another, a free-for-all. And due to the fact that no one actually expected this battle to happen, no one would be in any sort of strategic formation. It would be utter chaos. Nonetheless, a shuttle would manage to retrieve Vader and his two captives and take them back to the Eclipse. And as the shuttle returned to the Star Destroyer, Vader would see multiple troop transports launching from both the UER ships and the Rebel ships, as both sets of enemies had the same simple idea: board the Eclipse and neutralize the Emperor. As Vader stepped out of the shuttle, he would be greeted by sirens and fire. The boarding parties would have already, well, boarded. Vader would command the troops with him to escort the prisoners to meet with the Emperor himself, and after a moment of hesitation as the troops would question, not out loud, whether this was really necessary considering the current situation, Vader, Ahsoka Tano, former Captain Rex, and a small number of stormtroopers would walk to the Emperor's throne room aboard the Eclipse. During that short journey from the hangar bay to the throne room, Vader would sense a familiar presence. But anyway, the small group would enter to find the Emperor sitting calmly on his throne, whilst a reasonably large for the size of the room group of UER forces pointed blasters at him. He would welcome Vader and say that he was glad that Vader could join him along with the traitors who had joined the Emperor. Vader would walk up to the side of his master and stand to face the room, just as a group of rebels joined the already quite busy room. So just to clarify the situation, we have Vader, Palpatine, Ahsoka, Rex, a few Imperial Loyalist troopers, a few more UER troopers, and some Rebel troopers all in a room, and those with blasters would be pointing them at everyone who wasn't their own side of the fight. Suddenly, Vader would sense that presence again, and would realise that one of the rebels was not holding a blaster. It was the pilot, the one that had destroyed the Death Star. It was Luke. It was Luke Lars. Vader's rage would burn, and he would choke the boy, lifting him off the ground and towards Vader. This boy, adopted or not, his family had failed Anakin's mother, and for that he would suffer. But just then, as everyone in the room watched as the life from Luke's eyes began to fade, Vader would see something glint underneath the young boy's coat. Something familiar, a lightsaber, his lightsaber. Vader would drop Luke to the ground and would ask the boy how he got the weapon, to which Luke, after getting his breath back, although he would only be partially conscious, would respond that Obi-Wan Kenobi had given it to him, that it used to belong to his father. Vader would say that Owen Lars was no Jedi, to which Luke would say, as his consciousness faded due to the lack of oxygen, that it was his biological father's, the father he'd never known, not even a name, and Luke would pass out. And just like that, it would all make sense to Vader. Tatooine, the Force sensitivity, the lightsaber. This boy may have thought he was a Lars, but Vader could finally see it. This boy was his son. Vader would look up at this room full of conflict. Fear would radiate from everyone in the room, mostly due to the way Vader had just overpowered rebel hero Luke Lars. Well, fear would radiate from most people. Luke would be unconscious and Palpatine would just emanate sadistic glee. Oh, and Ahsoka would be trying very hard to mask her fear. Eventually, one of the UER officers would gather the courage to tell Vader to move out of the way, that they had come for the Emperor, and even Vader couldn't defeat them all. Vader would ask the officer whether he was sure, and then would proceed to choke everyone in the room with the Force. Well, except Ahsoka, Palpatine, and Luke, because he'd already choked Luke. At this point, Ahsoka would call out and say that he needed to stop. This wasn't him. This wasn't Anakin. But before he could respond, Palpatine would cut in, saying that of course it wasn't Anakin. This was Darth Vader, and that she was a fool to think that Anakin was there. Ahsoka would start to say that Palpatine was wrong, that she knew that there was still light inside him, but Vader would interrupt, telling them that they were both wrong. That Anakin Skywalker was still alive, but he was also Darth Vader. Ahsoka would try one more time to appeal to her former master, asking him whether this was really what he wanted, a galaxy where he was just a tool for fear. She would continue by saying that they could begin to set things right together. After a rather long silence, Vader would reply that she was right, that this wasn't the way things should be, and drawing his lightsaber would announce that this galaxy should be his. And with that, Vader would engage both his former apprentice and his now former master. The three would fight, and after a while Ahsoka would be knocked down, with Vader then knocking out Sidious, who would fall next to Luke. Vader would walk over to Ahsoka as she lay on the floor, and in that moment she would sense Anakin, but not the Anakin she knew. On Tatooine she had sensed turmoil, as if Anakin was trying to overcome the dark side. Now this would be replaced by an acceptance, a strange calmness, as though after 20 years Anakin had accepted he was Vader, and Vader had accepted he was Anakin. The last thing Ahsoka would ever hear was Vader's voice saying that he was sorry, and then the swing of a blade, then nothing. Vader would stand over the body of the Togruta and see his path, his future, was not in the past, it was with his son. Speaking of Luke, at this moment Luke would wake up. Vader would begin to explain who Luke was. He would tell his son that together they could put right the chaos in the galaxy, that together they could rule and put an end to this pointless violence. Vader would walk over to Sidious's throne, and as his back was turned, would hear a saber ignite. Turning quickly, he would watch as a blue blade impaled Emperor Palpatine, who would have just attempted to kill Vader. Luke would retract the blade, and then would say 2 words, "Together, Father." And so, Luke would join Vader, and together they would rule. Vader the Master, Luke the apprentice. The rebels, the UER, the galaxy would all eventually yield to Vader. It would definitely help that Vader would convince the UER members on the Eclipse to join him, and once he had established enough control over the UER, the now stronger Imperial forces, as they were united, would destroy the rebellion. Vader would also be a better military leader than Palpatine, due to him having more experience, and so finally there would be peace, both within Anakin and the galaxy. And finally, what about Rex? Well, after waking up and seeing Ahsoka dead, his closest friend over the last 20 years, Vader, Anakin would offer him a role in his new empire. After a moment of thought, Rex would, as politely as possible given the situation, decline, saying he couldn't, and would turn to leave the room, fully expecting a blade through his back. But one would never come. Vader's only act of mercy leaving Rex to re-enter a galaxy where one more thing had been taken from him. And that's about it. That's what I think would have happened if the galaxy had found out that Vader was Anakin Skywalker soon after the events of Episode 3. But also, what would have happened if some Imperial forces had formed a coup? Thanks for the suggestions, and remember to leave any suggestions of your own in the comments, because I do read them, and I tried to incorporate 2 together, so let me know if you think that worked, and if you'd like to see more of that. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all of that stuff. Thanks for watching. Bye!